Welcome back, everybody, to the Functional Code. We are excited to bring you guys today a new episode. We are going to be talking about training tissue. Today, we are going to be getting into the volume problem. We're going to talk about how to grow tissue, train tissue, rehabilitate tissue, maintain tissue. And we're going to talk really in depth about the neurology of it, the physiology of it, biology. We're going to get into the depths of this, and it is so important that you guys understand it is not just lifting a dumbbell and moving in a certain direction. There's a lot more that goes to that, and I think it's important you guys understand that and be efficient with your time. So, as always, I am Dr. Addy.
And I am Dr. Jace. Yeah, it's going to be fun. We're going to dive into different ways and times that you can use these intensities that you generate with your body. And how much do you need? How much do you not need?
Yes.
And then also with the volume aspect, are we overworking the body, and is that causing injury, tissue failure? And that's where we're going to dive into a little bit more in depth on a bunch of different concepts to give you guys a general understanding, and also some actual applications for you guys to use. I think we're going to go into a week's programming for a general example, but more importantly, understand the principles so you can utilize it for your everyday life is going to be so important.
Beautiful. I think a lot of this was brought about even back when the golden era of bodybuilding was getting started, and everyone was in the gym twice a day for 6 times a week, and these concepts were myths, and they didn't even think that this was something that you could do with less but gain more.
For sure.
And I think a lot of people still think that's not correct. I think there's a lot of people that could listen to this and really save their bodies, if they could just adapt this concept. So I'm excited for you to dive all into this. Doc, when we're in the gym and we've been training and we're starting to plateau and it's like, all right, time, just add more, do more sets. Why is that going to make it worse?
So there's different ways that you can send the signal from your nervous system to tissues. If you go into more a concentric, eccentric phase, so concentric shortening the joint or muscle, eccentrically lengthening, similar thing, that bleeds more into the muscle aspect, versus if you go more from short to long, eccentrically, that bleeds it more into the tendinous, ligamentous aspect, or isometric squeezing as everything's lengthened for periods of times and periods of intensities, can shape and send different signals for different tissues, more or less.
And it's important we hit all those tissues.
Oh, for sure.
Most people
100%.
Just hit the muscle belly most of the time?
Yes.
Yes.
And some of that we'll get into when we get into the concept of how the nervous system attaches to the tissues. A very good point.
Yep.
But yeah, if the volume is the one thing, if we're being smart about it, are we overworking the muscles and we're causing all these injuries in the connective tissue? If so, then that's where Dr. Addy was saying we got to bring up that foundation of that connective tissue so it can withstand force from the muscle tissue.
Yeah.
So that's where volume is not always the main key. It's being smart with the stimulus, being smart with the recovery, and being smart with the signal that is sent to the tissues. And that's where we're pretty much going to preface for different sections we're going to dive into today.
Beautiful.
Yeah, this is something that in the past, especially earlier in my career, I've had to figure out, do certain people, whether they're older or younger, do they need different needs for their programming from a rehabilitation standpoint?
Yeah. Yep.
And you can start noticing that younger folk, they tend to recover easier, quicker compared to the older. And there's a bunch of other stuff that we've touched on before, but that's where the more you dive into this specific field, this specific topic, the depths are pretty low, and we're going to get to some of those. Working smarter, not harder, is going to be the main aspect for the most part there.
So, Doc, when we break down an actual motor unit, so that, and we talked a little bit about this, I think, on one of our last podcasts, but we want to give the listeners just an idea of how it works, how an actual motor unit works and fires, and why it's sometimes difficult to get all of them to fire in a certain area versus not only that, and then trying to get other areas to fire different planes, talking about all of that. Why is that important?
I love it. So in this point, we're going to get to the brain to body connection, and we're going to dive into how motor units, they send the signal to the tissues, and then what specific muscle, what specific tissue is being attached to that signal. So we're going to start off with the central nervous system. So let's say there's spinal cord, brain, and then we want to send a signal to, let's say, the bicep. Oh, my drawing is terrible. So this signal attaching to this bicep. Now, when we're looking at the signal being sent, the all or nothing principle states that each signal sent from the spine nervous system through the neurons and then to the motor units at a specific layer of muscle tissue, especially in between the perimysial grooves. So there's epimysium, there's perimysium, and then there is endomysium. So it's different fascial layers connecting different bundles of muscle tissue. So let's say we would cut the bicep in half. So we have bone, middle, humerus, if we will, on this one. Now let's say from right here is the bicep. So we're going to do a bicep curl. So this signal, if we do the bicep curl the same way every time, maybe we switch it up and do it more horizontally instead of by our side. That's awesome, that's fine. That's where you get into patternized training. And when the motor unit goes into a deep muscle layer, so let's say there's different bundles, and then there's even more different bundles within there. So it turns into circles upon circles within circles kind of deal. And it's small motor units that can attach in these small layers. So let's say we're doing the bicep curl, right? Same way every time. We're addressing this line of tissue over and over and over again. So more or less those motor units around right here are being stimulated, okay? What are not being stimulated? Maybe the other ones on the sides. So if we're not addressing all the tissues around there, these muscle bellies, sarcomeres, if we will, those will start to get stimulated, and those will almost overpower where the signal is not being sent to the other tissues. So when we're addressing each area, that then goes into, if you guys have heard our podcast for a while, workspaces, joint movement, and you can build up that so you can address multiple tissues and layers around the whole joint and whole muscle belly. And that's where the signal being sent has to be very specific. So when we're going back to the all or nothing principle, the signal sent from the brain to the tissues, if it's sent to only these sarcomeres, that's where we'll probably notice, depending on the type of intensity, the strength or duration of the intensity, that's where you can see that certain areas and growth properties occur from there. But when you're stimulating bicep, like especially the machines that you see in the gym, they have the pictures, biceps, triceps. People think that if they do this exercise, that they're getting the whole belly. They're getting this whole thing. In fact, they're only getting a small portion. And that's where it's not 100% true. And that's the first thing you need to know when addressing the tissue building, that the signal has to be sent in multiple ways. So how do you send it in these other ways? And that is where you add rotational movement. So you go workspaces, say level 3, to where you're going through the biggest range of motion. But from right now, like instead of doing a bicep curl, how I typically would, I would maybe try to rotate and go the opposite way or come inwards, changing the angles. Because that goes back to our point with the sliding filament theory, to where actin myosin contract, relax. However, and that's in a 2D model. When you look at a 3D model, you start noticing that they permeate laterally, which has the very big importance of angular movement and angular stimulus being sent. So we're addressing more tissues. So we're spending our time wisely, because tissues can only adapt so many times throughout everyone's life. Yeah. And that's where we start getting to some of these specifics.
Yeah, I think for those listening, what Dr. Jace, just refresh so you guys are still with us. The all or nothing principle is when a neuron fires, it activates all the fibers in the unit. But if you just do the same training over and over again, it's only activating that unit each time. And that's where you're going to ignore the other units, and you're going to not get stronger and have a bigger mass because you're missing other units of stimulus, basically what is being said.
100%.
Now with that, there are definitely times where I'll ramp up a training protocol and I'll get to a certain point and I plateau. And if you have been an avid lifter or if I've been working out for longer periods of time, you'll know what that feels like. And for me, I used to always just think, I got to lift heavier. I got to go bigger. And that was just always what I think through, whether it's watching documentaries of lifters or just reading online or whatever, I think there's still a lot of information out there for that kind of.
For sure.
I remember still when I first got into it, it was eat big, lift big. That was that was like an Instagram thing that I came across with a really big bodybuilder. And I'm like, all right, if it's that simple, perfect. I'm going to eat as much as I can and I'm going to lift as much as I can. And you'll probably get some change. In the end, you're going to end up hurting yourself, probably.
More likely.
And you're going to, unfortunately, train, like you said, you're going to get into this area where you're going to train only a certain amount of the tissue. The rest won't be as conditioned. You set yourself up for risk of injury. And you're probably going to get either bored or feeling a certain way of not growing or progressing. And then you're going to get frustrated and probably stop lifting or change your frequency because you're just not getting the gains you've wanted. And there's just definitely another layer to making changes and growing, and I think I'm excited to have listeners understand that too, because I've been there. I've been frustrated and I've been excited, and then unfortunately I felt, what's the word I'm looking for, a little bit frustrated when that gain isn't continued. So yes, I think, and it's the same thing with rehabilitation. You gain maybe like 80% of your range of motion back, but you still have 20% left and you just can't quite get there. And that's the same thing with patients. There's going to be times where we got to switch up how that stimulus is being sent so that we can get that full 100% rehabilitated.
I love that.
Yep.
Well stated throughout all that. And I think a lot of people actually to that point they find themselves, they injure themselves, or kind of like you said, they get quite frankly, sick of doing the same thing over and over again, and you try to switch it up, you try to go online, what works, what doesn't. Do you have the capabilities, or does your tissue body have the capabilities to even do those stimulus exercises? And I think that's important too. So as we're getting into this next section, this is where we're going to break apart the stimulus, intensity, and recovery. So when we look at the stimulus versus noise, this is where the signal sent matters much more, and a lot of this is based on the accommodation effect. It's also very similar for the SAID principle, specific adaptation to imposed demands. So there's a few things that can accommodate. It could be the intensity can accommodate, the tissues can accommodate, whether it's muscles, whether it's connective tissue. There's different means of progression for each person. There's other factors, whether it's a hormonal factor, whether it's someone has autoimmune, or whether someone has cognitive impairment, and then going to a genetic level as well, whether certain genes are turned on and off over a longer period of time. That will also affect the accommodation that person can acquire over time.
And what is accommodation, Doc, for those listening?
So accommodation is pretty much the body's biological energy saving response to similar and repetitive stimuli over time. So like the body can adapt to certain intensities, it can adapt to certain movements. That's why when you look at a cheerleader versus a football player, yes, one may be female, male, but you look at the training styles, you look at what's the demand required for each one, you're going to start noticing a bunch of different differences. There's a few similarities here and there, but you have to be very specific with your training as well. Now, let's take a step to the side to tackle it from this direction. Now, when you look at a person that is untrained versus trained, a person that is untrained, you're going to start noticing large growth effects really soon, whether it's someone working out for the first time or a patient that hasn't experienced any physical medicine, chiropractic work. You're going to start noticing, for most people, change of effect, whether it's range of motion, less pain earlier on. And then, like you said, that 80% is trying to get to that 20%. That's where it's the slow growth, ups and downs as the person gets better over time. So what signal are you sending? If they start noticing if someone's plateauing, whether it's there's certain people are working out, maybe it's 6 weeks later, a couple months later, they start plateauing. That's where you want to look to change the stimulus. Honestly, from day one, you want to make sure that you change the stimulus, because the body can train in different periodic episodes or cycles throughout the year.
So you like the idea of changing up the stimulus more frequently than like an 8-week program where you do something different, or you do something for 8 weeks and then you change it. You like the idea of maybe even every other session change the the stimulus.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And it depends. Like
Maybe weekly or something.
if you want to train like power versus strength versus hypertrophy, that can be different than when you look at it from a day-to-day standpoint.
Sure.
And then you also have to think, what tissue are we specifically training per day? And we'll get into some of this here after a bit, but there's only so many resources for your body to heal, repair certain tissues. So if you do a full body workout, did you send the stimulus to where the intensity is at its highest form? And if so, maybe that tissue is adapting, but maybe you didn't send as big of a signal to another part of the body and it's draining the resources. And that's where you start noticing the person either goes into fatigue. So switching up can mean, let's say someone wants to work on their upper body power. If you work on like speed and strength at a similar time or in different focuses, you can still do that principle, but maybe one day is on the pecs and another day is on maybe the shoulders or something like that.
Yep.
And not just the shoulder, not just the anterior deltoid of the shoulder muscle, in the middle, the posterior. It's what specific line of tension within the 15-degree range are you trying to target in that small area.
Yep.
And that's the stimulus. That's the part that we want you to be very specific with and what you're trying to send, more or less.
I know, I believe it's Mike Metzer and Dorian
yeah.
Yates have that concept of doing the most with the rep, with the perfect form, time under tension as possible to, like you said, drive that stimulus's intensity to the max, to really like neurologically stimulate an area as much as possible. And I think they were one of the first to bring this concept back in the day, and it was challenged a lot because people thought that there's no possible way that you can do less and get more of an outcome. And it's cool to see. It's cool to see that our bodies can be dialed like that without having to overtrain. And for those of you listening, it might even be a sigh of relief to say that you don't have to be in the gym 6 to 7 days a week to look good and fit. You can get by with a lot less if you are just intentional and listen to Dr. Jace.
And I think that goes into the recovery is just as important
100%.
as
Yep.
the stimulus and the training. That's where you start noticing these bodybuilders. They're working out 3 days a week and the rest of the time is recovering so they can maximize each session. But when they're in the session, it's like hours.
Yep.
You gotta send a bunch of signals in a couple different areas, but it depends on the day, the week for them.
But they've perfected the signaling. And if you truly just watch an hour or two long, some people will post, it's intense.
Dude, it's crazy.
It's phenomenally intense. And maybe you'll get there one day, unless you don't want to be a bodybuilder. You don't have to get to be that intense if you don't want it. But there's a reason they look the way that they do.
I love that. And that's where I know for myself, I won't probably ever become a bodybuilder.
No.
I just want to be as fast and as explosive as I possibly can, but also taking a long-term approach. I never want to get injured, and life happens. And then I want to make sure I maximize my longevity as well.
That's huge.
So
I want the fullest range of motion possible in my joints as long as I can keep them. Like,
stated too.
That's really it for me. Maybe at one point I'm going to put on a bunch of weight, which I keep telling myself I'm going to. I mean, I have been. Again, I'm definitely a lot bigger than I was, and that's getting there. But it's not important to me to lose health to get there, going through a cycle of some drug or using something that I think would affect my organs or my health to get there, which there are other people that get such great results with those kinds of things, and power to them. It's amazing stuff that they can use out there to really change their bodies, and it's fun to see that kind of change. But for me personally, I'm okay taking the time to get there without needing those kinds of extra efforts.
Yeah, and I noticed like you've definitely gained a decent amount of muscle mass even from our first episode.
Get in there.
Looking at those pictures right now.
Consistency is really another thing that I think people forget about is how much consistency for different, we talked about that too, hypertrophy, consistency versus speed versus power versus all those other things. There's definitely a different kind of frequency of stimulus needed for each of those too.
Yeah.
And it's crazy how quickly my muscle came back after I took a break within a month or two, just taking a little bit of a break, what that muscle memory looks like too. That's pretty interesting. But anyway, so I think we're getting off topic.
No, I love that. So Doc, another fun perspective that you can look at from this, and this is where my mind always goes when I'm trying to stimulate or trying to grow or rehab a specific small area. The stimulus sent to that area, the area will adapt based on the frequency and the intensity of the signal.
Okay.
So more or less what I mean by that is, like, if you consistently send the signal of like your max effort as hard as you possibly can, the body's going to send resources to build up, whether muscle, tendon, ligament, any type of tissue, even bone to a certain extent based on a specific stimulus sent. That will adapt, but it's the signal of the nervous system that forces drive to the body to build up, break down, or maintain that area. It's going to be very important. So that'll get into our next point on the intensity. I almost think about intensity as like a meter. So when you look at a meter, 100% is like the max effort your muscle, body, tissues can possibly give. Then there is 0. So it's that signal from like 0 to 25%. 25 to 50%, that small range, that is more for the rehabilitation. That's more for when you want to send resources for the body to slowly start building up. Once you get to 50, 75, 90-ish%, that's where you're either maintaining the same tissues you want versus like the 90 to 100%. That's where you start sending that stimulus for the tissues to adapt, like you're trying to gain more access to areas. You're trying to build and open things up from there. So that's where you start noticing that intensity. Now there's also an intensity above 100%. And that's where you start getting to the absolute strength, to where, this is back in the Soviets when like they're building up, in the Soviets, like in the, gosh, I think it was 70s, 80s, they sent all the resources and funding from the government for the training purposes. I think a lot of this had to do for a mental mindset against the Americans during the Cold War, but that's where you start noticing all this research around this training. But a lot of the foundation of the training today came from that specific time frame.
I did not know that.
It's incredible. So that's where they start breaking down what are the principles of strength, or what are the only ways that you can lift. So you're training 100% max resistance, max intensity. That's what's known as, for some, maximal effort method. And then there's a dynamic effort method where speed and velocity is going to be the most important thing. And strength and speed are very similar. When you look at the intensity to move a heavy object, you're going to be moving incredibly slow, versus a lighter object, you're able to go quicker.
Yeah.
So instead of going max effort at the max amount of load, you're taking off load and you're going for speed, which adds
so max
into a
effort,
principle.
just quick.
Yes,
with
quick effort.
Probably less resistance, but
Yes.
you're at least doing it as fast as you can do it.
100%.
Got it.
So that changes the signal from the nervous system to tissues, which can get into explosive movements, which can get into certain athletic abilities, which can also help reframe from, if you're older, tripping on something, falling and breaking a hip. And then the other one is repeated efforts till failure. So this is like time to failure, time under tension, moving a weight, an object, a body part, as long as humanly possible until you fatigue out for that one rep. And then there is repeated efforts not till failure. So you're setting the signal to where maybe you feel good muscle burn, but you still could do more. And that's that signal sent. So we're wanting to either send the signal to muscle failure, repeated movements, not till failure. We're going to failure as much as hard as we possibly can for that rep. Speed at a high rate or strength at a high rate.
Doctor, would you say that a lot of people unfortunately fall into the not getting to failure as a reason to why maybe their stimulus intensity isn't met at fullest capacity, and would that be another reason why individual, because what I've been told, and from what, a lot of people that I listen to, is if you don't get even close to not getting to failure, your growth will be limited and minimal at best. Is that true?
To a certain extent, yes. Depends on trained versus untrained.
Sure.
That will get us into like the 3 training zones, which I'll get to in a second, because part of it is either we're sending the signal for the tissues to rebuild, and most people aren't sending that signal.
Got it.
They're going to a decent amount of effort, but it's either not for a right amount of duration time in that signal, or they're not sending to the fullest ability because they're afraid, more common than not, that they're going to injure themselves, or that they're afraid that the recovery is going to be sucky afterwards,
for sure.
Deal. But then you can get into what's known as like a retraining zone, and that's you're just maintaining it. I think more people than not are in that zone. And then there's the detrain, where it's the rehab. So we'll get into some of that. But
got it.
Yeah, that's a dang good question, though. Most people definitely need to ask themselves.
Yeah, that makes more sense. Or they need to also realize that there's other ways to train other than lifting a sub-max weight 5-10 times when they could have did it 50 times, but they didn't question, like you just said, they didn't question themselves.
100%.
And now they're like, why am I not getting bigger?
Yeah, and you can even look at it from the perspective of, let's say, if you've noticed, there's people with ab belts that stimulate the tissues without you doing any work. You can almost apply that same principle to what's known as a Russian stimulation, to where you put like a tensor, or so like the electrical pads on your skin, and it usually attaches to a machine, and that machine sends the signal to the tissues through your nervous system, not brain, spinal cord out, just so everyone's on the same page. But that will stimulate and force a contraction. So you're doing effort, but without your mental abilities, which part of it I argue slightly because you're missing that brain cortex connection through with the cerebellum into the tissues for coordination, proprioception. So if you're not getting that, yes, you can build the tissues, but then that makes it more important to send the stimulus to the connective tissue so you don't overpower those. So when you're sending the high intensity signal, you can do some of this without even having effort. Just like you put it on, you go throughout your day, your office worker, you have to be probably careful if you're getting twitches and typing or something like that. But yeah, so there's different ways around it. But ideally, you'd want that system, that signal and intensity sent from your body on out from there.
Other than an exogenous form.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Sure.
There's time and place, especially rehab recovery of any tissues. Love that quite a bit. So going back and looking at like the summary of the points, so strength is usually neurological first and biological second, to where the signal needs to get sent for the tissues to respond, to send more resources to build those up. Untrained athletes grow at a higher volume versus trained athletes grow based on the intensity. So we have to send the signal. And then a combination to volume is inevitable. However, a combination to intensity can be delayed. So the intensity matters even more. And then recovery is proportional to intensity, not just to sets done. So I like those key small points.
So we talked about these different zones, Doc. You talked about how we can stimulate tissue to grow. We can maintain tissue or even retrain tissue at a certain point, but then we can also detrain tissue. And so I think it's all dependent on what signals we're sending at what times. But these all 3 zones are important to learn and understand when we are talking about the whole tissue and body as a training concept. What does that look like, and how do we target each zone?
So we'll have a visual for those that are just listening. So when you're going into working out, when you're trying to rehab train, you can gauge your nervous system a little bit easier. We've been talking about the stimulating zone, to where you go to a high amount of intensity or at a great deal of speed, or you go until consistent movement till failure, like those 4 different types of strength training. Regardless, we want to send the signal as hard as we possibly can. We only need 1 signal sent, either for probably within 24 hours, 12 to 24 hours, because you could go into probably 2 different sessions to send the signal. Depends on the recovery aspect of your nervous system, which will matter so much,
Yep.
which will have the greater deal of growth potential, because we know sleeping causes most gains,
Yep.
recovery, rest causes most gains at that time.
Yep, yep.
So when we're getting to trying to increase that stimulus, you're going to start noticing, even with accommodation of the intensity, if you spend and do every training session for maybe multiple body areas, you're going to start noticing that the body's going to acclimate to that higher intensity, and that's where you start noticing that you can also plateau there. So that's where you have to work that stimulus in with retraining zones at the same time. So stimulating, high, strong signal, you want to adapt, grow. Now let's say, and this can be sport specific, this can be rehab specific. Let's say, for example, we have a tendinopathy or like strain of bicep tendon, shoulder supraspinatus. It's hard for us to lift the arm. A couple things going on with the rotator cuff. Doesn't really matter too much. When we're thinking from the perspective of stimulus, intensity, signal, we want to make sure that we're targeting a very specific structure that is injured and that we're varying the intensity of the stimulus. As the injury starts to get better, you start noticing more range of motion, less pain. You can start increasing the stimulus higher and higher into the detraining zone. So like going back to the point, 25, 50% intensity, 50 to 100%, 95% intensity. So the more strength you're getting back, the more resources their body is sending, but also at the same time, once you rehab that area to where you feel like you're back to normal, you're probably not yet. If there's any injury, it leaves anatomical change to the body long term. So you have to consistently maintain that, but you can build that up. So once you're able to get to your highest intensity after that injury and ramp it up, give yourself a couple weeks to one monitor and maintain, not between sessions, but maybe one signal sent to that injured tissue after everything's been built up. At the end of the rehab portion, that's when you can start getting to the stimulus and then a retraining zone. So it's not all the way until you are able to ramp up that intensity at 100%, anywhere from 3 to 20 seconds, 3 to 30 seconds of holding that signal of intensity at a high rate and feeling decent for days afterwards. You're probably going to be sore due to delayed onset muscle soreness, DOMS, but then you can get into retraining zones and kind of work it in to the cycle of what body area you want to work on certain days, certain weeks, certain times of the month.
I think it's important to, another way to think of that would be like you were able to lift your max that you haven't been able to lift in a while one time.
Yes.
Okay, try twice, 3 times. Okay, 3 times I couldn't quite do it. And you're like, all right, so maybe you're not fully how you should have been, you know what I mean? Or even just a little bit under max. But now let's say you continue to weights, train, and next thing you know, you try to get in 2 weeks, and you did that just under max 12 times. Now you're thinking, okay, at the 3, I wasn't fully back to where I was. So now you just have to understand how much that should be thought about when we are trying to gauge if we're ready to call ourselves healed, I guess is maybe the best way to put it. But anytime we train, we're very at a superficial level, breaking or destroying tissue. So are we really ever fully healed? No, it's just making sure that we give our body the appropriate recovery needed at each time, because they're little minor insults. And then there are times where those insults are possibly a little bit bigger or smaller. Whether we lift something wrong, that insult just became worse because it was put on the tissue that wasn't ready and ended up doing something that was more harmful. Now eventually that insult may even turn into an injury.
Yes.
That's where we start to lose the ability to lift, and the range of motion goes down, and now you're in a much, much worse position. So when you get to that point where you're lifting and then you had a little tweak and you're like, okay, yeah, I think I'm good now. That was an insult and that was a message. And you just have to make sure that you catch those, because if you are doing something wrong, you're more than likely going to get a message, an insult. And eventually those insults will cycle into an injury, and you got to make sure not to have it get to that point.
Yes, and I love the direction you're taking that. That then goes back to what are we training? What signal is sent to what specific tissue?
Beautiful.
So we're saying the highest stimulating zone, highest bout of intensity. Is that going to the muscle? Is that going to the connective tissue, ligaments, tendons? Is that going to the joint capsule? Are we trying to open up range of motion? That's where you have to be very specific on, are we going to the muscle? If so, it's going to be concentric, eccentric. We're doing the traditional lift. Maybe you're changing the angle. So like, for example, I suggest you guys to try this at a lighter weight starting off if you haven't tried this before. Bench press, for example, for those that are not watching. Traditional bench press, okay? Now, how often are you going either bench press, like working your way up from neutral to almost like up overhead, but as you're laying down, versus, so incline versus decline, but doing this all at a flat surface. So that's changing the different pulling mechanisms on certain tissues. Okay, so there's muscle also. I love you guys to try this. Let's change as we're rotating the arms, like we're tilting side to side. Be careful when you tilt at the top because you can jam that chromium from the supinator and some of the other tissues. It can affect the bicep head tendon, so be cautious as you're tilting with higher weight.
Control movements.
Yes.
Make sure you feel in control the whole time.
Love that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that's where form matters. If you're going to stay in neutral zone, you can ramp up higher intensities, the areas that your bodies and tissues are accustomed to. But if you go into different zones that you're not accustomed to, higher amount of focus attention, diminish the weight that you're putting those load under, because if you're not training this area, higher risk of injury. And that's where if you're not training certain positions in athletic events, you're going to start noticing different injuries because the tissues aren't able to absorb the force or angle against gravity or against weight or against an opponent, and then they just give out and yield from there.
Yeah.
So going back to the point, let's say bench press, right? How often are you squeezing the weight at top with all your muscles or all your arms straight? So at length, holding a weight, load under tension, and contracting all the muscles from there. That'll bleed subsequently a little bit more pressure on the joints, but it bleeds more energy to like the ligaments, tendons on the muscle belly because we're loading at length versus with everything short. So let's say we're holding the weight in a bench press when everything's lowered to the chest. So that is where we can start noticing, are we training in a short range when everything's either for our arms, they're short, chest it's open versus at the top, chest is short, contracted versus arms straight. So then you can start zoning in the bench press. Am I working specifically on the bicep tendon around the elbow, or am I working the chest, the pec major on the insertion, origin attachment, and building up that connective tissue? So you have to start looking at from each tissue, each joint level within a certain movement. Then you have to be specific, like where are we training? So build up from there.
Yes. And too many are not training the connective tissue and joints.
Oh, definitely not.
Huge miss. People are missing out there. Yeah.
Now, retraining zones. And this is where most people that work out on a regular basis, they're staying in this retraining zone to where maybe they're not sending the signal for the tissues to rebuild. They're doing a lot of work. They feel like they're putting the effort. It's maybe a moderate intensity instead of the highest intensity. And that's okay to be in this range because we're still maintaining tissues to where some of the research is at. Depends on what property that you want to train, but strength hypertrophy is anywhere of training plus or minus, God, if I remember off the top of my head, 16 to 24 days-ish. Don't quote me on that. I think I'll have an image I can pull up. Versus, let's say we want to go at speed. Speed, you have to train every plus or minus 5 to 7 days. Yeah. And then let's say we want to maintain certain areas of certain muscle tissue that maybe you don't use on an everyday basis, but other areas of the body that you want to maintain. That's where it's like a plus or minus like 20 to 30 days. So if you just want one stimulus at a high intensity signal, at a high retraining zone or stimulating zone, once every 30 days, once every 16 to 20 some days, you can start mapping that out on your calendar. Today, I'm doing this body area at this zone for this amount of time. You can be incredibly specific, not have a very low risk of injury compared to everyone else. You can have peace of mind that you have the best quality programming for you. And then if you do workspaces or joints, you can monitor and maintain each joint capsule, each tissue on a daily basis.
Yep.
So there you have a recipe for success. But yeah. So with this retraining zone, this maintenance recalibration, let's say you're setting the stimulus in a workout session, for this example, the bicep, but maybe we want to do retraining. So instead of doing arms, maybe we're setting the signal for the biceps, but we're still doing moderate intensity weight. We're not just pushing ourselves on the triceps. This can be for any other part of the body, because we want to maximize the resources in our body for the recovery aspect, but we also want the signal sent to the exact area. So that's where we have to be very, like we said, very specific. And then that kind of brings us into our next training zone, this detraining zone. And this is where, for us as physicians, for people that are starting the rehab process from any acute injuries, this is the process, this is the zone that we want to build in and be around. And then from there, and I was thinking about this, funny enough, in the shower this morning, like, how can we push people? Because we start noticing people get better, they're out of pain. Once they're out of pain, they stop coming into the office because I don't need any more. And then, like, in my mind, I'm cringing because the pain is the first thing to go. But yes, we built them up, we helped them, we're a team along this health journey, but they haven't built up the tissues to the fullest resilience. They haven't pushed themselves too much, and it's working out of the detraining zone and trying to push that stimulus as much as we can. And that's where partially our challenge of the week came from. On certain positions, we have patients go in and they win a $10 Sal and Go gift card. And that was mainly so we can push the intensity for certain people at certain times.
And I love that.
Yeah.
Because I think you're right. I think individuals a lot of the time use pain as an indicator of health, which it's a part of it, but it's not the whole story. And too many times they wait until the pain is gone and then they just resume daily activities and the pain comes back again because they weren't fully healed and or conditioned after that injury. We talk about that all the time, how to appropriately heal an injury to its fullest completion, because if you don't, your chance of injury only continues after you keep injuring it.
100%. And I'll have kind of a picture up here too, because I think this is important. When we're looking to rehab and build up the tissues, for muscles, you can train either type 1 muscle fibers versus type 2. Yeah. Whether we're holding a lighter, low intensity contraction, maybe very lightweight, for as long as you possibly can for a long period of time. And that's where we start noticing this duration intensity type of chart, to where the lowest intensity you can hold for as long as possible, and then it slopes downwards to where the highest intensity you can only last for so long holding that contraction. And that's where, when you start noticing, are we wanting to build, let's say, architecture? So this would be largely for the connective tissue. This would be, to a certain extent, you can go type 1 muscle fibers or the stabilizers of your spine or your core, to where you're holding a very light contraction in maybe a position and you're going as long as you possibly can. Low intensity. Then as you're building up to, let's say, for example, muscle tissue, or you're working in the signal up, the intensity sent for maybe a lower duration versus like space accumulation, to where, like for workspaces, for example, or we want to build one part of the joint, we go through the workspace's fullest range of motion in the joint, and then attach a stimulus and a signal at maybe one part that maybe that person has popping, snapping, clicking in this exact angle. We put our hand up to a wall, block it out, try to go at end range and start isometrically or squeezing the muscle or the joint, the tissue, without moving it, at a higher signal as hard as you possibly can for as long as you possibly can, obviously working into that. Change the angle or keep that intensity as you're going through micro, small rotational movements. putting pressure, either isometric, contracting, put pressure into the wall or even off the wall. So that can get into opening up different aspects of certain joint capsules. There's only so much space that you can accumulate within a joint, depending on whether it's ball and socket, hips, shoulders, versus fingers is a little different based on the connective tissue, the muscle tissue around it. But more so than anything else, let's say for ball and socket joints, you can open up that range. But if you only have so much space, that is where the signal being sent at the joint is the first to send the signal to the brain, whereas the overlying muscle tissue goes to the spinal cord, slight delay at interneuron, then can kick back up. So the space is going to be pretty much the predetermining factor, and quite frankly is one of the only pre-protein things and how our body is adapted from the womb into how it makes our body. Like the proteins on a genetic level pretty much encode for space in certain areas.
Dang,
thus open up shoulders, hips. And I think that's why all humans are similar. I don't think we know the answer 100% for sure, but we do know it's one of the only things pre-protein for. There's other aspects of genetics, turn on and off for genes, but yeah.
That's interesting.
It's quite fascinating, really, yeah. Going back to the detraining zones, this is where you can use like either a deloading phase. So let's say you're going through, you're training, you're ramping up your intensity, you're at a high point, you're like maybe at week 6 out of 6 in your hypertrophy power training, and you're wanting to end that cycle. This is where you can also go back into the detraining, maybe take a week of very light movement, maybe go to see a massage therapist, chiropractor, do some rehab, light intensity type movements, just to get your body acclimated. So we're ramping up off that nervous system for a good solid week, can be up to 10 days as well. And then you can build up either a different mesocycle or different, let's say we want to train maybe speed plyos for a 6-week train. Maybe we want to train like strength, hypertrophy, doesn't matter. So you can build up from there, but use these detraining zones to offload what you've already done to build up into something else. But that varies based on the intensity of the nervous system.
Sure.
Day-to-day basis, if we will. So very important, detraining zone, heal, rebuild, reload. Very important to understand stimulating, retraining, detraining, and then what specific tissues are you sending, because that way it goes back to our point of specific adaptation to impose demands, to where we're sending a very specific signal to a very specific tissue for that tissue to adapt to impose demands.
Yes.
It's one of those things. And then as you're varying based on the accommodation principle, not doing a high intensity stimulus for an area for every single time, but to offload, detrain it to like moderate intensity and then touch that peak of high intensity and come back down.
Do you feel like Galpin's analogy of the bowling alley would fit that in a way?
I think so, yeah.
Being able to come off and adapt helps to keep the adaptation of the tissue stronger, because you're going from not just stimulus, because eventually stimulus alone, volume alone, your body, your bowling alley gets smaller.
Or do you want to explain what that was?
Yeah, so he talked about in terms of HRV, heart rate variability, where you can put yourself into a state of stress and then try to bring yourself back down into a parasympathetic state. And so you go from sympathetic to parasympathetic. Now, if you don't put yourself into different states of stress and then train yourself to get back down into a parasympathetic state, your bowling alley lane gets much smaller, meaning it's easier for you to get stressed, it's harder for you to come back to, there's less of let's call it a lane for you to exist. Whereas if you can push yourself and then train yourself to come back down, your lane gets much wider and there's a lot more room to, I guess, manage your recovery and your outcomes and those kinds of things. So I think in a way this sounds very similar to that, because the end of the lane would be straight stimulus of growth.
We're pushing the barrier of the stimulus to make a bigger lane.
But you don't want to, in terms of the bowling alley, you don't want to be in the bumpers the entire time. That's true. That's not going to be, eventually that is just going to get smaller. Whereas eventually you're going to need to stay in the middle of the lane at certain points of time. Otherwise, it's just going to get harder for you. I think that applies.
I think it absolutely applies, because that then goes into the third leg between the stimulus, intensity, and recovery. So we send the stimulus, we send the signal. Now is when we're trying to go, like you said, that bumper lane, the highest portion, high signal. And now is where we want to recover and bring everything back to homeostasis. Yep. I think you hit the nail on the head. That's a really good add-in on that one, man. Let's go. So when you look at recovery and why it's so important, like we said, we have to go back to homeostasis to where keep our body working within that. I love this bumper lane aspect. And then push it, the signal, to higher stimulus, to open up the lane, and then come back to center. And that's where everything we've talked about, from sleep, there's a sleep podcast, everything from, God, we talked about red light laser therapy with Josh in the past.
We've talked breath work.
Yeah.
We've talked different types of rehabilitative training.
Yes.
We've talked about nutrition. We've talked about hydration. If you still have questions on recovery, please just let us know in the comments. But we'll direct you to a lot of podcasts we've done, because we really obviously, as chiropractors, exist in that area quite well. So
now, let's say, for example, I don't know if I believe in recovery. Okay, let's take this into example. If you're not allowing your body to recover, you're eventually going to send so many resources, or your body's going to be drained of so many resources, and then it's not going to allow for the adaptation based on what you're trained for. Injury then occurs. You start noticing that fatigue can happen, to where your nervous system drive, your energy, your immune system function, even like motor learning, and how you can address like even proprioception, balance can also be pretty much affected. And then you can get into these like chronic stress states, and then you can find yourself in this odd loop. So there's a definitely downhill deep crater if you don't pay attention to this.
For sure.
Doc, is there anything else you want to add on that one?
No. Doc, what does a week look like in trying to use all of these zones so that people can get a better understanding of what that should look like versus maybe what they have been originally doing?
Yes. No, thank you for bringing that up. And I would take this with a grain of salt, because each person has to be very specific based on past injuries. So take this partially with a grain of salt, but as an example that you can fill in. We'll have an image on the screen as well. So Monday through Sunday, the focus can be either a high stimulating focus. So we're going into the stimulating zone, higher intensity. You start noticing, okay, maybe for this Monday specifically, we're going to work on 1 to 2 like strength hypertrophic sets to either failure, with maybe one main movement. So whether it's the squats we want to address all the muscle tissue, maybe starting off in the mid-range, like the mid portion of the quads or mid-glutes. And we want to work like a continuous like squat working set until failure at different either pulsations or different like depths into the squat. Or when you're at the bottom of the squat, are you able to either rotate a little bit to the side so you can bleed energy to certain sides of the muscle belly of the quads, glutes. You can add in maybe into a squat, add in a little bit of rotation. With this, you probably want to lower the weight if you're going to test different zones of movement, because you're going to send the stimulating effect much quicker to the untrained tissues versus, let's say, if you want to send the signal at a higher straining or higher stimulus, just your normal everyday squat that has perfect form. Then you want to go till failure, maybe just working in different zones, or going slowly into a deep squat, staying there, maybe working up maybe 25% out of your deepest area of the squat and work back down. So you're constantly staying under load in different ranges for as long as you possibly can.
Yep.
So we're sending that signal Monday. You can work in maybe some detraining calves, feet work, or isometrics when all your muscles or all your legs are straight. You're just squeezing the connective tissue or the whole muscle belly. So that can be like a signal sent that day as well. If you want to, you can either focus from the legs, from the squats, to something of like Bis, tris, detraining, wrist forms, fingers. You can do that detraining as well. Okay, so let's go into Tuesday then. Tuesday is going to be the recovery and mobility, so we're detraining. So we went high stimulus. We're going to go back to homeostasis, bring everything back to center, detrain. Still doing activity, effort, work, but we're working on a different part of the body. So maybe instead of muscle tissue building, we're working on cardiovascular health. So then we can go into like zone 2 cardio for maybe a lower intensity, just getting into a nice easy jog for a longer period of time, upwards of like maybe 30 minutes before getting on, whether it's treadmill, bike, elliptical, doesn't matter for the most part. Doing full body cars, workspaces, full range of motion for each joint, and then slowly start to warm up like in a running stance, so you can so you can prep those tissues going into a jog and then go into the jog afterwards. And if you want to do from there, maybe afterwards like a foam rolling session with a pin and stretch, so you foam roll in a tight area and then move that limb where you're moving around it, so you can create glide between tissues. Whether you want to go into, let's say, a deep stretch, so you want to almost open up fascial plasticity to turn down what's known as the gamma motor tone. Maybe then we're holding certain areas of stretching for anywhere upwards of 2 to 30 minutes for each muscle belly. You can get into that on that day. I wouldn't go too intense or too long on this, like the static stretching. And if so, when you get into that stretch, force a very small muscle contraction as you're stretching so you can utilize that length. So Tuesday, recovery day. Now, Wednesday, we're going to get back into retraining, and then this could also be certain skills. So if you're an athlete, maybe you're working on technique for a soccer player, dribbling, ball work, juggling to a certain extent, versus someone that is maybe a bodybuilder. The skill, effort, and then pretty much the training itself kind of work in the same fashion. So let's, for example, a hang clean is more of a skill movement because you have to have decent technique so you don't injure yourself. So depends on what skill you want to work on there, but I would keep it moderate intensity, low to moderate intensity, whether it's workspaces, trying to get to that fullest range of motion, pushing that line of tightness for each area that either you're working for the day or full body. And then you can get into some pattern work of not putting, let's say here, not necessarily pushing the highest amount of intensity, but working on either certain body parts, whether you want a lower or upper day, but we're slowly ramping back up. And then that's where we get to Thursday, to where you have a stimulating set. Now, maybe for this one, we're going to isolated, focus on like hypertrophy on certain weak points of when we do our workspace, maybe certain parts of what joint we find to be more weak for that day. We're trying to accumulate and grow and get into more space. So we get into the workspace, full range of motion. That's where, going back to the example, we put our arm up against the wall. We force the highest amount of intensity either into the wall or isometrically squeezing without moving your arms, and then or up off the wall opposite direction. And that's where we can build up, because we only need one signal sent, maybe 2 to 3 reps max for certain body areas, maybe 1 to 2 max on different parts for that day. And this can be in different body areas, but it gives you a good idea in terms of the signal. And then, much like you would think, high stimulation, and then we're going to go down to detraining. And there's Friday active recovery, whether it's a mobility, very low intensity circuit, more blood flow work. You can get a massage, a lymphatic drainage. You can get into like meditative breath work for that day as well. And then Saturday, much like you would think, we're going to ramp back up. Strength skill day, maybe high movements, 70 to 80% effort. Don't want to grind through this. You don't want to be maxing, but we're sending the signal for whatever body area you want to work that day. And then Sunday, again, detrain, longer cardio session, breath work, guided stretching. So when we're sending the high amount signal one day, you can either go a couple days on setting the signal and then offload. But when you first start off, if you go high intensity one day, you want to deload the next. That's more why for this flow chart. The more trained your tissues get, the higher, and that goes back to the intensity aspects. You have to be more strategic with the signal. Then you can get into phases of 6 weeks hypertrophy, to we're saying that signal maybe 2 to 3 days in a row, and then we're offloading for maybe a couple days. Maybe we're going to ramp up before going on a trip, and then when you get out of the trip or during the trip, we can slowly ramp back up. You can get into these cycles as well, but you need that recovery aspect. You need the detrain, the offloading. You can't push maxes for upper body one day, core the next day, and then lower body the next day. There are only so many resources in our body to build up from there.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there are different days you can try to stimulate while detraining, but you're saying we want to try to completely leave it at a different zone each day then. To a point.
Work.
Yeah, of course.
I think it depends on.
As a bodybuilder, that might be different.
Slightly, but we're even seeing bodybuilders that are training 3, maybe 4 days a week, and they're still keeping their gains. But during those sessions, they have to make sure their body is fully recovered.
Sure.
Or
as best as it,
decent amount recovered, to where when they send that signal and then they go an off ramp and back off, get into more of a recovery status. Again, we know all the growth occurs in the recovery sleep, all that. So theoretically, it would make sense to where you don't need to be in the gym 24/7, 7 days a week.
So they're almost becoming engineers of their tissues. Like they are stimulating it with the most intense stimuli that they can think of that works best for them.
Yes.
And then they're understanding physiology, they're detraining and then recovering.
Yes.
And making sure that what the hard work that they just put in gets its best effects with sleep and growth in the off time.
100%.
And
so
it's such a different thought process than I think what we're used to. All right, Doc. So let's do a what we used to think to what we should think now kind of segment. If we upgrade from this idea of work harder, we should now think what? Probably
stimulate smarter.
Okay.
I like
Back to the intensity versus volume talk.
Specifics.
Yep. How about no pain, no gain?
I know we hear this a lot.
Yep.
Then I started thinking, okay, no pain, no gain, no recovery, no progress then.
Because if we're not recovering, there is no growth. That is the growth time.
100%.
And I think a lot of people, we talked about how stress and sleep can affect your gains. We talked about that in the past too. I think it's more important.
It's so true.
How about more reps, more exercises to grow?
This is one where from a clinician standpoint, definitely need to be better. But based on principles outside of the systems that we have, you want fewer exercises, but higher quality signals and being smarter with those signals. Because I know we give our patients a lot of exercises, and that was more for them to have as a resource, just so they can tissue target and understand and learn their body better. But I think a lot of people don't understand that you have to be smart with what signal you're sending. So yes, you have all the resources. You don't necessarily have to be in doing all those exercises, but that goes back to fewer and smarter signal-wise.
And for them too, it's pretty, they're detraining most of the time. It's not really too stimulating. But when we move them from that pain-free to now goal push mode, that's where they got to start thinking more of the signal as an important 100%. Versus just doing the reps. Because eventually, like we talk about, they get to that 80%. And then how do we get to that 20%, extra 20%?
I can't wait to send all the patients, for certain times they start plateauing. Just watch this episode or this clip or mid or whatever, and there it is.
Intention.
So true.
Always train to failure, train to exhaustion.
I think there's certain times that is needed, but what's our goals? Are we going more for adaptation? Are we going more for growth? If so, then train to failure maybe once, twice a week for certain body areas, and then off-ramp deload. Then goes back to the recovery aspects.
And then cycle.
Yeah.
For sure. Volume is the solution.
I would say, recovery, you can multiply things much quicker if you have that focus. Again, send the signal, recovery, huge focus. So volume, problem, especially when people are rehabbing, or let's say, for example, I like this example too. Years ago, and even still today, NBA players, they either take rest for the recovery, or they build up the small connective tissue or other areas around their body for the recovery, thus to build the capacity. So you're actively recovering, you're accelerating the healing growth factor. Sleep, rest are important, but that's where the brain to tissue connection comes in place. So we're going to raise that capacity, thus withstand and heal faster and not have as much risk for injury moving forward from there. So
I'm curious what LeBron does. How does someone create as much mobility, strength, and effort as he does, still in his 40s, and having very little injury over his career? Man, I'd argue that he's not using something like this.
I would assume.
Yeah,
I know.
there's just no way that he's not on top of those adaptative states and trying to push himself, but then also recovering. I know he spends like $1.5 million a year on certain recovery. Supposedly.
Yeah.
I'd argue that there's not some of this involved.
I think he's had one trainer ever since he was younger, like college, early pros, and that trainer's been with him. Now, that trainer, that would be the one I would be curious on of, does he have other resources and how to schedule pretty much the maintenance of LeBron's body, within to a certain extent, of course, but just to monitor one person, I think I would absolutely love that. You can dive into so many areas. But then that comes with, obviously, the mental frame that you're pretty much giving your life goal, job towards that person. So there's a whole weird mental dynamic there. But
for sure.
Yeah, no, that'd be interesting. Yeah.
Alrighty, that was a absolutely brain expanding podcast. Well, and I really think that a lot of you that are listening are going to hopefully change up just a few of your typical workout week practices. And I think if we can get to that point of understanding how much recovery is still and so important when it comes to a training protocol, it's only going to benefit you long term, even short term too. So Doc, is there anything else you want the audience to take from this pod today?
I appreciate it. I would say, yeah, going back to the part, if you need to go back and review through certain systems, we'll have timestamps below, because I think understanding these principles for you, yourself, and your human body long term, these are the things, this is part why we do the podcast. Like, it's giving you guys the tools that you need to maintain your body long term, and working out is such an important part. If you can monitor the intensity of your nervous system connection, less risk of injuries, better building your body up, less time needing to be spent in the gym, which opens up personal life, man. These are awesome things.
Yes.
Yeah.
So take what we say, listen, do it. And let us know how things go in the comments. We'd love to hear from you guys. And as always, share, subscribe. We appreciate each and every one of you guys. And until next time, you guys have yourself a good day.
Woo!
Disclaimer, the content provided in this health podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or 911 immediately. Reliance on any information provided in this podcast is solely at your own risk. The creators and hosts of this podcast are not responsible for any actions or decisions you may take based on the information presented.
Thanks for joining us on The Functional Code. For more evidence-based health insights, subscribe, rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. Remember, your journey to a healthier you begins with understanding the Functional Code. Until next time, stay well, stay informed, and embrace the science of living well.